So the American Civil War, it cost over 600,000 lives and literally tore the nation in two. But when the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the war wasn't really over. In a lot of ways, the battle for America's future had just begun. This is our explainer on Reconstruction, the turbulent, violent, and incredibly important era that would go on to define the nation for a century. The central question was just monumental. How do you piece a shattered nation back together? What does freedom actually mean for 4 million people who were just emancipated? And maybe most importantly, who gets to decide the answers? These weren't just some abstract debates. They were urgent, life or death questions that would shape America for the next 100 years, and honestly, they still echo today. You see, at its heart, Reconstruction wasn't just one single policy. It was this brutal, three-way struggle for the soul of America. First, you had the reconciliationist vision. This was all about national healing, let's just move on, often by kind of downplaying slavery as the real cause of the war. Then there was the emancipationist vision, which argued no way, the war's whole promise of freedom has to be fulfilled with full citizenship and equality. And finally, you had the white supremacist vision, which fought tooth and nail to keep the old racial hierarchy in place. These three ideas were in a constant, and often violent, collision. So to really unpack this complicated period, we're going to walk through the story in 6 parts. We'll start with the immediate aftermath of the war, move through the political fights in Washington and the violent resistance in the South, then look at the federal government's attempt to enforce its laws, the era's eventual end, and finally, its really complicated legacy. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1865. The Confederacy is in ruins, but the nation is now facing a whole set of questions with absolutely no easy answers. The entire country was in completely uncharted territory. Like, were the southern states still states, or were they conquered territories? Should Confederate leaders be punished, or should they be pardoned? And towering above it all, what was the legal status of 4 million formerly enslaved people? Were they citizens now? Could they vote? The answers would all depend on who got to decide, the president or Congress. And that power struggle, it would define the first few years of Reconstruction. And this wasn't just a political crisis. It was an economic cataclysm. The South's entire infrastructure, we're talking railroads, bridges, farms, was just gone. To give you a sense of the devastation, get this, 40% of all the livestock in the South was killed. The whole economic system, which was built on slavery, had totally collapsed, leaving millions of people, both black and white, in poverty and uncertainty. This devastation really set the stage for a fierce political battle in Washington. With the South in shambles, the debate over how to rebuild it quickly turned into a showdown between the president and Congress. So on one side, you had the presidents, first Abraham Lincoln, and after he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson. They wanted a quick, lenient path back to unity. Lincoln's 10% plan, for instance, was incredibly soft. It only asked for a small fraction of voters to pledge loyalty. Johnson went even further, handing out thousands of pardons to ex-Confederate leaders. But on the other side, you had the radical Republicans in Congress. They saw a soft peace as a total betrayal of the Union cause. They wanted to fundamentally remake the South, to revolutionize Southern institutions, and make sure the rights of freedmen were protected. Their plan, the Wade Davis bill, demanded a much stricter loyalty oath from a majority of voters. What really lit a fire under the folks up north were the actions of the Southern states themselves. Given a free hand by President Johnson, these new Southern governments passed a bunch of laws known as the Black Codes. And let's be clear, these were a thinly veiled attempt to reestablish slavery in everything but name. They restricted Black people's ability to own property, to move around, and forced them into really exploitative labor contracts. For the Republicans in Congress, this was all the proof they needed that the South had learned nothing and that presidential Reconstruction was a complete disaster. So the backlash was swift, and it was decisive. In 1866, Congress passed a historic Civil Rights Act, right over Johnson's veto. The next year, they went even further, passing the Reconstruction Acts, which basically dissolved the Johnson-approved state governments and put the South under military occupation. The whole conflict peaked in 1868 when the House actually impeached President Johnson. He was saved from being removed from office by a single vote in the Senate. And right in the middle of this firestorm, Congress passed and sent out 2 of the most important amendments in U.S. history. The 14th, which defines citizenship and guarantees equal protection, and the 15th, which granted Black men the right to vote. But this new order, imposed by Congress and backed by the U.S. Army, it was not going to go unchallenged. Down in the South, a violent counter-revolution was brewing, led by men who called themselves Redeemers. And their goal was to restore white supremacy. And you've got to understand, this resistance wasn't just a few isolated acts of anger. No, this was an organized paramilitary insurgency. Historians have even called these groups the military arm of the Democratic Party in the South. Their goal was simple: use terror and intimidation to overthrow the Republican state governments and stop African Americans from voting. Now, the most famous of these groups was, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, but they were far from alone. You had the White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in the Carolinas and Mississippi, and they were just as brutal and effective. They operated right out in the open, targeting black leaders, white Republicans, really anyone who dared to challenge the old order. The violence was widespread and just horrific. This quote from an official report to Congress gives us a chilling glimpse into the reality on the ground. It describes a reign of terror where murders and assaults were so common that they were literally impossible to fully count. This was political terrorism, plain and simple, designed to destroy Reconstruction from the inside out. So, in the face of this insurgency, the federal government under President Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected in 1868, decided it was time to fight back with the full force of the law. And this was a pretty unprecedented expansion of federal power. In 1870, Grant's administration created the Department of Justice specifically to prosecute the Klan. Then, Congress passed a series of powerful enforcement acts, which made it a federal crime to interfere with a citizen's civil rights. The most powerful of these was the Ku Klux Klan Act, which gave the president the power to declare martial law, send in federal troops, and even suspend habeas corpus, that's the right to be charged before a court, to completely crush the insurgency. And for a little while, it actually worked. The Grant administration's aggressive prosecutions pretty much destroyed the first version of the KKK by 1872. But, and this is a big but, this success was really fragile. A major economic depression, the Panic of 1873, hit and shifted the North's attention to money problems. Political fatigue started to set in, and as the North's commitment to enforcement started to fade, new and even more brazen paramilitary groups like the White League and Red Shirts popped up to take the Klan's place. And that brings us to the final fatal blow to Reconstruction, a moment that grew out of a constitutional crisis and ended in a backroom political deal. The presidential election of 1876 was one of the most contentious in American history. The Democrat, Samuel Tilden, actually won the popular vote. But the electoral votes from 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were all disputed because of widespread claims of fraud and voter intimidation. Both sides claimed they won, and the country was on the brink of another huge conflict. To solve the crisis, a backroom deal was struck. In what we now call the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats agreed to let the Republican Hayes have the presidency. In exchange, the Republicans agreed to pull all remaining federal troops out of the South, effectively trading away the protection of black citizens' civil rights for political power. And the removal of those troops, that was the nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. Without federal protection, the last Republican governments in the South just collapsed, and the Redeemers took full control. This started the era of Jim Crow, a system of legal segregation, voter suppression, and racial terror that would last for almost 100 years. Understanding this moment is absolutely key to understanding the long struggle for civil rights in America. You know, the legacy of this period is something we're still grappling with today. If you believe that understanding this history is valuable, please take a quick moment to support our work by clicking that like button and subscribing. It really helps us continue making explainers on these critical topics. So, how should we remember Reconstruction? Was it a complete and tragic failure? Or was it something more complicated? Maybe an unfinished revolution? The legacy is really two-sided. In the short term, it was, without a doubt, a failure. The promise of equality was broken, and the federal government abandoned African Americans to a brutal system of oppression. But its long-term successes are just as huge. The constitutional amendments passed during this era, the ones abolishing slavery, establishing birthright citizenship, and guaranteeing the right to vote, they laid the legal foundation for the civil rights movement a century later. They were a promise that, even though it was abandoned, was never erased. And this leaves us with the question that historians still debate today. Was Reconstruction a noble experiment in interracial democracy that was violently overthrown and just abandoned too soon? Or was it a fundamentally flawed effort, doomed from the start by a lack of national will and that fierce resistance? The answer, as it so often is, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Reconstruction is one of the most important and misunderstood periods in American history, and its questions are still being debated. To keep exploring, make sure you check out our other explainers in the U.S. History playlist, which is linked below. Thanks for joining us in unpacking this unfinished story.